thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to the World Affairs Council. I thought it would be appropriate with the fact that we just looked back at the birth of the nuclear age with the tragedies at Hiroshima and Nagasaki as to what happened, to actually sort of look back and say, why are we still here? And so I'm going to try to go through sort of the 80 years of how we survived in the nuclear age. I show you all the institutions I'm affiliated with, including in 2006. I gave a talk here, and I was given an honorary degree at one of my favorite little schools at Mines, just down the road. And I had many, many colleagues at Mines and still do. So let me start from here. That's going to be what I focus on. In view of the time, I'm not sure I'll get there, but if I do I'm going to say, and what now? After these 80 years, what's changed, what happens? So let me move ahead. And indeed, I also want to extend, my condolences and really the sorrows of what's happening across the United States. You look back 2 weeks ago, at the Bible school killings. I mean, can you imagine that? And then, just yesterday, Charlie Kirk and what's happening, and he gets assassinated. And then, of course, just 12.5 miles from here at Evergreen. And in our family, that was particularly tragic because our grandson teaches at Ralston Valley Elementary School, which is a big feeder school, for Evergreen. And so it was just an enormous tragedy. So when you look at that and you think about that all around, then you'd actually say, why worry about nuclear stuff at all? I mean, we've got enough problems as it is. But I'm going to try to convince you that we should be thinking about nuclear things. And I thought the best way to sort of bring that point across is, just a couple of years ago, we had the Oppenheimer movie, Chris Nolan's. And the Oppenheimer movie ends this way. Oppenheimer presumably goes to see Albert Einstein at the pond in Princeton. And indeed, they did spend time together. But this, Nolan was taking sort of a license, with the truth. It didn't happen that way, but it was good for the movie. And that is, Oppenheimer goes to see Albert, after all of it, and he says, Albert, do you remember when I came to see you at Berkeley? And I told you that we were concerned, while they were working on the atomic bomb at Los Alamos, we were concerned about causing a chain reaction in the entire atmosphere if we light this thing up and destroy the entire world. That's what he tells Albert. And Albert says, yeah, of course I remember. What of it? And Oppenheimer comes back and he said, I believe we did. And then the movie ends with the missiles, as you can see on the right, the contrails as the missiles are going up, and the world blowing up. And this was a 1945 discussion when the only bombs we had developed were what we call the atomic bombs, the fission bombs. And quite frankly, those were just the little ones. And that's what Oppenheimer was concerned about. And so if you think about that, and you think about the future, and you think about the next 80 years, you say, why are we still here? And that's because, whoops, let me see, actually, this is not quite going, okay, it's close enough. So 80 years, as I just mentioned, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, hundreds of thousands of people killed instantly. And not that World War II didn't know what devastation was all about, because they'd already killed millions of people. Altogether, nearly 60 million people were killed in World War II. And so we knew how to devastate cities. The Americans firebombed Tokyo on March 9th, 10th, 1945. and killed more than 100,000 people. So what was different about Hiroshima and Nagasaki that made Richard Rhodes, who wrote the book The Making of the Atomic Bomb, say, you know, mankind realized its own mortality? What was different that instead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instead of Dresden or Tokyo that were firebombed, there were over 300 B-29 bombers dropping thousands of bombs in those cities to destroy them. At Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was one plane, one B-29, one bomb, one city destroyed. That's what changed the entire world. And that's what nuclear is all about. And so indeed, in Nagasaki, for example, which was the second of those two, on August 9th, you know, of the 286,000 people living there, as you can see, 74,000 were killed instantly. And then more severe injuries. And then others eventually died from radiation. And so it was a total disaster. And in fact, what I like to try to have my students to understand, you know, the enormous power of those. And I was going to read those, but I'm going to have to read it for you. And this is an eyewitness account from a survivor at Nagasaki, Dr. Akitsuko. He said, "The sky was dark as pitch, covered with dense clouds of smoke. Under that blackness over the earth hung a yellow-brown fog. Gradually, the veiled ground became visible, and the view beyond rooted me to the spot with horror. All the buildings I could see were on fire. Trees on the nearby hills were smoking, as were the leaves of sweet potatoes in the field. To say that everything burned is not enough. The sky was dark, the ground was scarlet, and in between hung clouds of yellowish smoke. Three kinds of color, black, yellow, scarlet, loomed ominously over the people who ran about like so many ants seeking to escape. That ocean of fire, that sky of smoke, it seemed the end of the world." That's what I tell my students, and I read that to them to impress that, hey, nuclear is different. It's different because you tap the energy of the nucleus by splitting it or fusing them instead of the electrons that go around the nucleus. That's TNT, that's wood, that's fire, that's, you know, those are the electrons. When you split the nucleus, and that's what they did during the Manhattan Project, you release millions of times the energy, and that's where that power comes from, and that's why it's so different. Okay, that was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but those were the little ones. Okay, this was the big one, and the Soviets tested it in late October 1961. So the way that we typically say, how big is a blast? You know, we say tons of TNT equivalent. Well, when you go from tons, from chemical explosive, to the nuclear, you talk about kilotons. In this case, we were talking megatons. Not only mega, millions, but 100 million. And so this bomb that the Soviets fired up above the Arctic Circle as a test was equivalent of about 5,000 Nagasaki's. And this was 1961. So that's what Oppenheimer was concerned about. He could see that you go from atomic eventually to a hydrogen bomb, you go to this, and that's what they were worried about, destroying the world. So why are we still here in that case? Well, I'm here to tell you that it didn't happen. Okay, 80 years it's been since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We haven't destroyed ourselves. We could have destroyed ourselves. And particularly what I say is sort of a global nuclear order evolved, sort of an understanding, a realization that you don't want to go there because you're going to wipe the world out. And so what's happened over those 80 years is there's been no more use of nuclear weapons since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We've tested them in the atmosphere, and then after 1963, underground only, and since 1993, not at all. So no use of nuclear weapons. If you think about that, that's really remarkable. And then Oppenheimer was concerned that once you show the demonstration, like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, everybody's going to want to get one of these. I mean, that's what's happened with every other technology. But what's happened in 80 years is less than 10 countries have nuclear weapons. Now, that's more than we'd like to see, but that's less than 10. And then, why not terrorists, if they can get a hold of this? There's been no use of nuclear in terrorist attacks. No mushroom cloud, that's the bomb, and no dirty bomb, no dispersal of radioactive material. That's amazing. And then the good part of nuclear things, again, because it gives you millions of times the energy, you can do a lot of bad, but you can also do a lot of good. You can make electricity. You can use it for medical. You can use it for industrial purposes. You can use it for batteries that go to Saturn and to Jupiter. And we've done so. So that's the global nuclear order that's evolved. And I'm going to go through and tell you a little bit in a second. But let me first tell you, so what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the best way I like to describe that is if you look at the number of deaths suffered in war, as a function of century, and you see on the bottom, 1500, 16, and so forth. And what you find is each time that man, and here it typically was man, developed a better way to kill each other. We did. And so you look, 1500s, 1.5 million people, then 6.2, 6.4, 20, and then in the first half of the 20th century, World War I and II, it's almost 90 million people killed in war. Then come Hiroshima and Nagasaki and look at that drop. And so there's no question those bombs caused what I say is a discontinuity in the affairs of mankind. Somehow we knew that, hey, you don't want to go there. And so instead of that curve just climbing, which it looks like it was going to do, it came down. Now, we're still killing a lot of people, but we didn't wipe ourselves off the face of the earth. Okay, so now, in my 3-hour lecture that I've got planned for tonight, I'm going to spend about an hour each, on the Cold War, the post-Cold War, and then where we are now. So this is what I teach to my students. I used to teach this at Stanford. I retired from Los Alamos a long time. I retired from Stanford. I now teach part-time out in Monterey, out in California, and part-time at Texas A&M University. And so I teach them this history, over the course of a semester. So I'm going to try to condense that, as quickly as I can. But first, what I'm going to tell you as to how this global order evolved, this is my story. It's not a textbook story. It's my story, and what I claim, in terms of knowing something about the nuclear business, is that I've been in it a long time. And the way that it happened is actually, I thought I'd show you sort of my journey in the nuclear world. First of all, I was born 6 months after Manhattan Project was started. So I was born in October of 43. I grew up in Austria, and my father never came back from the Russian front. He was fighting in the German army after Austria was annexed. And so here's my mother, my stepfather, my little sister, and myself coming to America, 1956. So 11 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I was living in Austria. I was growing up, didn't have much, but nobody else did either, so it didn't matter much. Then we came to sort of God's country, the United States of America, where everyone had an opportunity. And I did. So, 10 years later, 1965, I graduated from Case Tech, now Case Western Reserve University, and here I am with my mom and my stepfather. And after I graduated, a few days after I graduated, I married my sweetheart, who's actually here tonight, my wife Nina, and we went to this place on the right, Los Alamos, the way it looked in 1965, on our honeymoon, and I worked at the lab. And that was my introduction to the nuclear world. And so I've been involved in the nuclear world on and off ever since. So the story I'm going to tell you is just the very brief condensation of sort of my life in the nuclear fast lane. So, as I said, I'm going to do this very quickly. So fast forward from 1965 to 1985. All of a sudden, I was there minding my own business, being a scientist at Los Alamos. And particularly, I'm a materials scientist, metallurgist, and so I study metals and things, including the most fascinating metal in the whole wide world, and it's called plutonium. So plutonium is one of those two things that you can use for bomb fuel. The other one is uranium. So 20 years after I came there as this summer student, the University of California that was running Los Alamos National Lab picks me as the next director. Not because of my own fault. I mean, I didn't have much to do with it, but somehow I became director at Los Alamos, and I took over January 1986. And then that was sort of my first year. First of all, they cut our budget. It was the Reagan budget cut. So here I take over as director. They take away a good part of our money. I said, well, how do we do this? And then, about 10 days or so after I became director, the Challenger shuttle blew up. Okay, and I'm here directed with this nuclear stuff, the nuclear weapons. And so that shows that, high-tech stuff can blow up. And then 2 weeks after I was director, the FBI came to see me and they said, hey, you've got a spy in your laboratory. His name is Won-Ho Lee. Eventually he wrote his own book, but so did two reporters. And they said, get him out of here. They said, no, we can't do that. We got to catch him in the act. Well, that took 12 years, it turns out. But in April, Chernobyl blew up, the biggest nuclear reactor accident ever. And then in October, this is during my first year of directorship, President Reagan at that time, Mikhail Gorbachev from Soviet Union get together in Reykjavik, and they say, let's get rid of nuclear weapons. And I said, how's that for job security? You're not supposed to be running this laboratory. And they said, let's get rid of them. Well, it turns out I still had a job because they didn't quite pull that off, but they did get together. So here I was. I told you I was not prepared. I did not audition for the directorship. That's what I was 42 years old. And I had these photochromic glasses. My wife said, you got to get rid of those. You look like a gangster. But this was my first news conference at Los Alamos, so a long time ago. All right, so then what happened? Along with that, we're in the Cold War. And what happened during the Cold War is, quite frankly, as you look back, the number of weapons that we built and fielded, it just, even though I was in the business, it's just ridiculous. So at one time or another, as you can see, these numbers up here, we're talking about 30,000 nuclear weapons. Not total built, 30,000 we had stationed at various places, ready to go. And the Soviets were playing catch up. This is the Soviet curve. And they got all the way up to 41,000 nuclear weapons. And so when you look back at that and say, wow, how did we not wipe ourselves off the face of the earth? And so somehow then, what one can say is deterrence. And deterrence means you're going to threaten the other person to say, don't do that, because if you do, we're going to wipe you out. And we call that MAD, mutually assured destruction. And it was MAD. But somehow, deterrence, we scared each other. We scared each other. But in addition to deterrence, if you're just going to threaten the other person, that means you're just going to build weapons forever. The other person does something, other country does something, you just build more. So you also have to have some sense in that, some cooperation, and that's the arms control part. You finally get together and you say, hey, wait a minute, let's not do certain things. And we did that with the Soviets, even though, they were obviously our enemies. So we did get through with all of those weapons and everything. We got through the Cold War. It required cooperation and certainly a good bit of luck along the way. And the right leadership, by the way. And that right leadership was really demonstrated through probably was one of the greatest crises in the nuclear arena. For those of you with gray hair and most of the people in this, you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, when the Soviets, Nikita Khrushchev, stationed the Soviet nuclear weapons on Cuban soil, 90 miles away from Florida. And they were ready. They had enough of them. They could have wiped out the whole east coast of America. And Kennedy was informed of that. And then lo and behold, the two managed to work it out. There are two great books, one written back 30 years ago now by Michael Dobbs, 1 Minute to Midnight. And the other one, just written now by this Sergei Bueche, who is a Ukrainian-American historian, a fantastic book. And so we managed to get through there. There was some luck involved, but there was great leadership. It was Kennedy and Khrushchev who, in the end, could have destroyed good parts of the United States and the Soviet Union, and they pulled back. We also had other things. I mean, we had accidents. In Palomares, Spain, in 1966, we had one of our bombers, 4 thermonuclear weapons, that means 4 hydrogen bombs on board. He's getting refueled, and they collide with the refueling plane. 4 bombs dump on the beaches of Palomares, Spain. 2 of them go off, but no mushroom cloud, because by that time we'd actually built a safety feature in that unless you specifically detonate a nuclear weapon, it just blows up the high explosive that's around the nuclear explosive. That makes a mess, and that's what happened at Palomares, Spain. They had to clean up the plutonium, but they didn't wipe out a good part of Spain. And then there were, a number of other things during the Cold War. So as you might imagine, with that many nuclear weapons on both sides, again, it took good leadership, it took a lot of luck. And then it also was important they were scared. And the Sergei Bueche, actually, in his book, he describes, that both Kennedy and Khrushchev were scared. When they found out what they're up, they were scared. And not only were they scared, the American public was scared. And again, for those of you around in the 1950s, you'll remember Bert the Turtle, and it said duck and cover. And then on the right here, the school children. I remember actually getting under the table, when I came to junior high school in Cleveland, Ohio. So this was serious business, and people were scared then. They're much less scared today, and that's one of the things we need to worry about. Okay, so that's sort of the Cold War. Again, this is a really condensed version, but then the Cold War ended. Somehow it's really interesting. And again, it's fascinating to study American politics as to what happens. I remember when Reagan came in, I said, oh my God, this guy's an actor. What in the world is he going to do, running this country? And then, of course, he gave the speech that called the Soviet Union the evil empire in 1983. And I said, oh my God, that's a good way to make friends. But lo and behold, when Gorbachev came in, Gorbachev realized in Russia that they were running their country into the ground economically. They were not going to make it, and they had to change things. And so he knew they had to open up. And my God, Reagan knew enough to step into that opening. And they got together in Reykjavik, and even though they didn't get rid of nuclear weapons at that time, they set a whole train of motion which essentially then ended the Cold War. So here again is that figure that I showed you with nuclear weapons going up, and then lo and behold, right after I came in as director of Los Alamos, I can take credit for look what happened, the stockpile. Of course, I can't take credit, but that is my 12-year directorship at Los Alamos. And so I was there then as director as our countries decided, this was nuts. We've got to do something to turn this around. And the two of them did. And I must say, I have to give them both credit. And at that time, around 1991, there's something called the Doomsday Clock, which every January, Doomsday Clock comes out and tells you how close we are to midnight. Midnight is sort of, it's more or less where we expect that civilization is going to end as we know it. And that's been going on since the late 1940s. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which I serve on one of the boards now, that makes the new clock statement every year. And back in those days, it was 17 minutes to midnight. That's the farthest it's ever been from midnight. So in other words, hey, this was a pretty good time. And I must say, from my own perspective, this was a time in 1991 going into 92, and then as the weapons were decreasing, at that time, I was not concerned about being nuked by the Soviets, okay, who, of course, then turned into Russians after the Soviet Union dissolved on December 25th, 1991. And so we were a long way from midnight. However, what happened right after that early January is by August, the Soviets didn't like what was going on, the hardcore members. So the hardcore of the Soviet establishment, shown on the upper right, they took and put Gorbachev on house arrest down in Sochi in the Crimea. They took away the keys to the nuclear suitcase, essentially. And that was one scary time. And then what happened is actually Boris Yeltsin, who at that time was the leader of one of those 15 republics of the Soviet Union, namely Russia. He essentially helped to turn the military around as they were coming to take over inside of Moscow. He jailed the perpetrators, and Gorbachev here was allowed to come back home. But it was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. But it was a time, we nowadays, we often make it awfully hard on our leaders as we look at, we've gone, through the many decades. And many other countries, take the view to say, look, America hasn't really done anything good for anybody for a long, long time. Well, let me tell you, there in 1991-92, America did stand up. And it did the right thing. And it was George H.W. Bush, to me, one of the most underappreciated presidents in the United States of America. He was also by far the best qualified of any that have ever served. He had done everything else before. And here he was, and Gorbachev was having these problems, he was just arrested. And he, in essence, what I say, he orchestrated a soft landing for Gorbachev. And he said, we're doing this mad. I tell you what, I'm going to take a whole bunch of our nuclear weapons off alert. I'm going to take them off all of the ships except the submarines. And he called up Gorbachev, actually, on September 27th. Hey, Mikhail, I'm going to do the following. And Mikhail was sort of surprised. He said, you're going to do that without insisting on reciprocity. And Bush said, well, I would appreciate, if you would do something. But yes, I'm going to do it unilaterally. And he did. And Gorbachev on October 5th reciprocated. And that's what turned the temperature down on the Cold War. And these were such critical times. And it was our president that did that. And then the Congress. Can you remember the last time the Congress did something really useful? Well, it was back then, 1991, 92. He had two congressmen, Dick Lugar. They both became very good friends of mine, actually, as it turns out. On the left from Indiana, and Sam Nunn on the right from Georgia. And they said, hey, look, we've got a problem. Yeah, the Soviets just went belly up, but what about their loose nukes? They had 41,000 nuclear weapons. They have all of this stuff. We got to be worried about what they're going to do. And he said, now we're not so much threatened anymore by the nuclear weapons in the hands of the Soviet government. We're threatened by them getting out of the hands of the governments of Russia and actually at that time, Ukraine and and Belarus and Kazakhstan inherited some of those Soviet weapons. So that was the new danger. And then there was also a new mission for Los Alamos folks. And that's what we worked on a lot, some of my colleagues here. And that is, how do we deal with this loose nuke problem? And just to put numbers on it, again, these numbers are just astronomical. 40,000 nuclear weapons. This stuff, the plutonium, it only takes 5 or 6 kilograms. Doesn't take much to make the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. Uranium, these days, you can do it for 20, 25 kilograms. Well, they had 1.4 million kilograms of this stuff. You know how many bombs worth that is? It was just in everywhere. The Soviet Union was 11 time zones. They had hundreds of these installations. And then they had 1 million people associated with the nuclear complex. And it was huge. We were worried about all of these things. It had the making of a nuclear storm. And then that's when I happened to be at Los Alamos at the right time. I had no use for the Russians. My father never came back from the Russian front. But this was time to reach across. And here I am, my first of 57 visits to Russia, by the way, in the last 30-some years. The first one, I'm on the right, the guy I'm about to shake hands with is the Russian Oppenheimer, Yuri Haritov. So we got together with them, being blessed by our government to say, yeah, work with their scientists, see what the problems are, see what has to be done to actually make this safe, make the weapons safe, make the materials secure. And we did. And the way that we did it, their scientists were just like ours. Scientists like to understand everything, create new knowledge. Engineers are different. Engineers, just let them build something. They're happy as can be. So we worked both with the scientists and engineers. We did experiments together over there, over here at Los Alamos. We did those, and here's, some of you know Steve Younger, being picked up by one of the Russians in a Russian bear hug after we did an experiment together. We did those experiments. Then we worried about nuclear weapons safety. We worried about nuclear security and so forth. So what actually happened, and of course now with Russia having gone rogue again, you say, was it really worth it? And in spite of everything that's happened with Russia, I said, you bet it's been worth it. Because we look back, of the tens of thousands of nukes they have, no loose nukes. None of them ever got away. The plutonium and the highly enriched uranium, again, I just told you it was all over there. Essentially, almost nothing got away. Experts, not any worse than what we've had. We have, every now and then we had somebody sort of cross the line, go in a different direction. Theirs wasn't any worse than ours. And the exports, we had some problems initially, Iran, a couple of other places where we thought they were giving some stuff away, but in the end, not much. So 30 years later, we've had no nuclear disaster, and that's what's really important. However, then came 9/11. So the other thing we have to think about today, besides all the shootings and everything else that we hear, is, back in 2001, we had the World Trade Towers. Nina and I were in France at the time. I was sitting on what's called a jury. It's called a PhD exam for one of their plutonium scientists, women actually. And it was terrific. I came back to the hotel. Nina had the television on. They said the second tower just came down. I said, what do you mean the second tower? It was this second tower. And look, this is the real photograph of George W. Bush being told at that very moment that the towers just came down. The horror. Then if you think about the fact, what if it were nuclear? That's nuclear terrorism, that's what you have to worry about. So in nuclear terrorism, the way at least that I define it, there's sort of 3 forms of nuclear terrorism. One is the mushroom cloud, the nuclear detonation. Unfortunately, it's not impossible to do that, but we haven't had it. The second is the dirty bomb. That's a radioactive dispersal device. You actually take the plutonium is not good for that. The uranium is not good for that. It'd be a waste of plutonium, quite frankly. But instead, you take stuff from the X-ray machines, cobalt-60, and all kinds of other radioactive stuff. That's much more potent and dangerous than plutonium. Plutonium, as it turns out, is only dangerous, really dangerous, if you make it into a bomb, you know. But other than that, if you ingest or inhale plutonium, then it can cause cancer. So in plutonium, you can wear a mask. You know, you can protect yourself, not these other things. So at any rate, you know, we've not had a nuclear incident. And just to show you that nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists is not impossible, this was another one of my exploits. I've been to Kazakhstan 6 or 7 times, and I actually went looking for plutonium in Kazakhstan. It was the old Soviet nuclear test site. And I know what we did in our test site in Nevada. I know what we did at Los Alamos. I went to talk to the Russians. I said, hey, this country doesn't belong to you anymore. The test site doesn't, did you leave anything behind? They said, we're never going back, because all they want is environmental, you know, restoration and reparations. So I went, and these were the ditches that were dug by what they call the copper cable thieves. And you know, the Kazakhs are nomads, so I expected to go out there, find them on camelback, pulling on copper. It turns out I finally wound up asking the Kazakh, I said, hey, what's at the end of some of those copper cables? They said, we have no idea. I went to ask the Russians. They sort of turned white and said, no, okay, we'll come back with you. And so we worked together for 12 years, super secret project, and try to get stuff out of, and sort of mitigate the problem in Kazakhstan as such. And so nuclear terrorism is possible. Again, it took the Russians working with the Kazakhs, working with the Americans to take care of this one problem. There are many others. Okay, what about other countries? You know, what we call nuclear proliferation. How many countries are there with nuclear weapons? I said there are less than 10. So the ones in red here are the ones that actually have tested and declared themselves as nuclear weapon states. The big 5, you know, U.S., Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China. India and Pakistan, you know, declared themselves, even though they're working on it for tens of years. They tested in 1998. And then North Korea is a particularly special case. They've also tested nuclear weapons. South Africa actually built nuclear weapons, but they gave them up back in 1991. Iran, I have that special color. They're still trying. Okay. So just to run through this really quickly, because the point I need to make is to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. The fact that we only have 8 countries takes cooperation. And it takes cooperation not only among the nuclear states that I told you, but the other states also, to make sure that they don't go nuclear. You know, for example, you hear a lot nowadays, hey, what about South Korea? You know, what about Japan? Do they want to go nuclear because the North has gone nuclear? You know, who else is going to go nuclear? But in the Middle East, you know, is Saudi Arabia going to go nuclear if Iran goes nuclear? Well, security alliances, allies are absolutely crucial if you're going to make this work. So just think about that and keep that in mind. Then all these other things, international organizations, export control, you know, you put certain controls on what you are willing to export in order to limit the possibility of other countries getting nuclear weapons. North Korea has the bomb, and as I mentioned, you know, Chris Hill tried to stop them from it. I tried to stop them from it. Several of our presidents have tried to stop them from it. And here, I mean, enough of trying to stop it. Here I am, actually. This is a plutonium glove box. The folks from Rocky Flats will know what that is. And here I am in the North Korean plutonium facility, because they were showing me what they actually were able and capable of doing. I've written this up in a book recently called Hinge Points, an inside look at North Korea's nuclear program. But the bottom line of the story, this is one sad story of 30 years, one president after another. It didn't care whether it was from the left, from the right. They all missed the opportunities to stop the North Koreans from getting there. And those are the Americans. Then you take all the rest of them, from the Russians to the Chinese, all of us failed. These guys are now one of 3 countries that can threaten the United States with nuclear weapons. China, Russia, North Korea, this little bitty country. But that's what we are. Iran, as I said, they've tried, they've lied, and the Obama administration reached a deal with them in 2015. Trump walked away in 2018. The Iranians had actually sort of walked away visibly from the bomb, but they were still continuing to sort of work underneath in that direction. And indeed, that again came about just in the last couple of months. In March, when the Israelis went ahead and bombed the Iranian nuclear sites, and then Trump actually followed up. And I've just recently written a piece for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, sort of taking measure of that bombing, both from Israel to Iran and then from the Americans. The bottom line of that is that we now actually have, in my opinion, an opportunity to try to keep the Iranians away from the bomb if we follow up. And in a very peculiar way, Trump has actually opened that up with the fact that he took the big bombs. He didn't destroy, they said they destroyed everything. They didn't destroy everything. But he created the opportunity that if we're now smart enough, one might be able to walk in and put a more permanent end to the Iranian nuclear programs. Okay, quickly, nuclear power. It turns out over the years, the U.S. has essentially generated close to 20% of its electricity through nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, pretty clean stuff, not much carbon. And the other countries, you can see France, it really did a lot. And so nuclear energy was booming along until we had reactor accidents. That stopped us in this country pretty much. But it looks like there might be a chance again for a nuclear renaissance. These 3 nuclear accidents, stopped things, at least in the United States. 3 Mile Island in '79, that was here. Chernobyl in '86 in Ukraine, and Fukushima in 2011. And now, and I've seen several nuclear renaissances, they all died out. Now it looks like we're again on the verge of people actually saying, maybe nuclear energy isn't so bad. And these data centers that are badly needed nowadays, they need a lot of electricity. And if you're going to be able to make that happen and not take the electricity away from all the households, you may indeed want to go nuclear. Okay, so then through all of those years, global nuclear order prevailed. Again, no use of nuclear weapons, limited proliferation, avoidance of nuclear terrorism, and a lot of the good stuff. But then, being so close, and maybe I could have seen it if I looked far enough, but then you could ask, no, wait a minute, you're telling me about a global nuclear order. How about the Jefferson County folks right around the corner from Rocky Flats? This was the bomb material factory. That's where we made the plutonium parts. We didn't make the plutonium here. That was made at Hanford, Savannah River. But this is where the plutonium was shipped, and then that's where we made the bomb core components. And I spent a lot of time at Rocky Flats over the years. At one time or another, they made as many, we call them pits, because they look like the pit of a peach or something. We call them pits. They made as many as 2,000 pits a year. I mean, it's just enormous again. And then, of course, there were the problems. The folks around Jefferson County over there, particularly, they said, hey, you're crapping up, the whole neighborhood. You got plutonium everywhere. And then in 1989, the FBI raided Rocky Flats, and many of those of you probably remember, and you know that. They raided them on June 6, 1989. They went in because they heard they were running incinerators inside of Rocky Flats, burning plutonium, contaminated stuff and throwing all that stuff up. Well, it turns out Rocky Flats never reopened in 1989. And as part of sort of the end of Cold War peace dividend, We've hardly made any more pits since that time. So it's like you know, trying to drive a 1960 car around and do all the things that you need to do. You sort of worry about how you're going to keep the lifetime of those. But anyway, I mean, that's what happened. And then, of course, people were mad as hell. So what happened? Well, it turns out the Rocky Flats story, let me tell you, I happen to like plutonium, as I said. You know, it's this incredibly fascinating element in the periodic table. It's so damn complex. I still don't understand it fully after 60 years. But, you know, it has bad stuff also. And so here in Rocky Flats, guess what? We cleaned it up. We cleaned it up. And people were worried about, you know, that lived close to Rocky Flats. Of course, it has exclusion zones. Well, since we've cleaned it up, you know, they've just moved right in on Rocky Flats. And it now looks like that. It's an environmental national wildlife refuge. And the way that it happened, I must say, some of my colleagues at Los Alamos, particularly good chemists who also knew how to talk to people. And they went there and they met with the citizens advisory groups. They went out to Jefferson County, you know, I guess we're here also, Jefferson County. They met with them, they explained. And the citizen would say, I want you to get every little speck of plutonium out of that ground before we say it's cleaned up. And my chemist friend would say, no, 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 you don't want to do that. You know, the plutonium doesn't go anywhere. And if you go and dig around in the ground, you'll just get it all in the air. You don't want to do that. We can take care of this place. We can make it safe without doing those things. And we did. And so that's actually one of the really good stories. However, you know, it's limited. At Hanford, the story isn't the same. Hanford is, we got a mess. That's the high-level waste from the reactors that make the plutonium. Savannah River, lots of it is a mess. Rocky Flats is in good shape. And then there's a lot of the nuclear testing history, the legacy. You know, we did spread these radioactive stuff all over the atmosphere. You know, we did some 200 atmospheric tests over the years, many of them out in the Pacific and then a lot of them around Nevada. Those are the legacies, that's what we have to deal with. Okay, so I've gone on a long time, so I'm actually going to do a teaser. I'm going to say, I'm going to open it up for questions at this time, looking at the history. And because I don't want to just keep talking the whole time, I want to give you a chance to ask questions. And then if there's time left, then I will answer these questions as to where are we now. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly, is there any life in the United Nations TPNW?
The treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Okay, so this history, you know, going back to the 1950s, is actually, there were countries like Ireland, you know, that said, hey, look, we need to do things to keep these countries like Soviet Union and the United States from just building more and more bombs. So why don't we get together, and eventually that wound up to be the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it has precedent with President Eisenhower, who in 1953 sort of said, hey, look, we're willing to share all these nuclear secrets. You know, only the Soviets, so we thought, the Soviets and the Americans know these nuclear secrets. We're going to share the secrets that you can do good things with nuclear, if you promise not to build nuclear weapons. And so it was actually Irish and other countries that led to that. And that was the Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in '68, went into effect in 1970. And with that treaty, the reason I have to give you this as a background is to do a good job on answering your question. So then as one goes back and says, okay, let's stop the other countries, because the idea was that by that time, the 5 nuclear countries, which then included you know, Great Britain, France, and China, would share these good things with you. You promise, if you sign this, not to you know, go and develop nuclear weapons. And the 5 countries that have nuclear weapons now, they promise to give them up, sort of in due time, all right? And that was 1970. Okay, so then we were in 1995. That treaty was extended every 5 years. 1995, they made it permanent. And then the other countries that didn't have nuclear weapons in 2000, 2005, 2010, they said, hey, wait a minute, you big guys, you 5 guys, you're not getting rid of your nuclear weapons. You know. So then they actually pursued this idea of having a treaty that specifically outlaws possessing nuclear weapons, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so that was then, ushered in by a lot of these non-nuclear countries. They were able to get enough countries to sign up, some 70 or 80 countries, that it went into effect, like by 2021. And so, you can ask, well, wasn't that a good idea to actually have a treaty that says no one should have nuclear weapons? And when I do my lecturing, to lots of different groups, I said, well, unfortunately, it sort of had the opposite effect. It's not good. Because my bottom line of everything that I work on in the nuclear arena is because of that enormous power of doing destructive things in nuclear, and because of the enormous good you can do if you do it right, like nuclear energy, it takes cooperation. You can't do it by yourself. And we got through the Cold War with cooperation. And we need cooperation now. And what that treaty did is, of course, the big 5 never signed that treaty. The other 3 that I showed you that are the declared nuclear powers also didn't sign that. And then our allies, like South Korea, Japan, etc., Germany, and so forth, they also didn't sign it. And so instead of getting better cooperation on all things nuclear, not just the nuclear weapons, but again, anti-nuclear terrorism, anti-spread of nuclear weapons, doing good things, you need cooperation. And what it did is it drove those 2 blocks apart. And that's the sad part of that treaty. So anyway, thanks for the question.
Go ahead.
Could you give us a few words on the evolution of the Chinese nuclear program beginning to present?
Right. So I know less about China than Russia. Actually, I showed, one of the pictures I showed was also a cover of a book that I've written on Russia that I edited. That one is called, in the spirit of what I just said, the book is called Doomed to Cooperate. Because with the Russians themselves told us we were doomed to cooperate. If we didn't cooperate, the world's going to blow up. We were doomed to cooperate. So I told you I was there 57 times. So I know less about China. I've been there only 40 times. Okay, but so to answer your question, by being there, meeting with their nuclear folks. I mean, that's what I do. I'm a nuclear guy, I'm a scientist, so I met with their nuclear folks. And have been doing so since 30-some years. So the Chinese, interestingly enough, were latecomers in everything nuclear. Nuclear weapons, they were first being helped out by the Soviets. So the Soviets helped them, they said, hey, look, we'll help you get the bomb. And then it turns out Khrushchev and Mao got into a real tiff, and Khrushchev said, okay, everybody home, and he pulled everybody back from China, and the Chinese were left on their own. The Chinese did it within a few years' time. They tested the first atomic bomb, the fission bomb, in '64. 27 months later, they tested the hydrogen bomb. So then they built their own nuclear weapons, but then after Mao was put aside and Deng Xiaoping took over, and he's the guy that really put China on the right path. And he essentially said, we're not going to conquer the world with military stuff. We got to get our economy going. We got to put the effort in our economy. And they did. And so what they did on the nuclear, and instead of 31,000 for us, 41,000, for the Russians, did a few hundred. And they did that for several decades, up to about 10 years ago. And then when the current president of China, and that is Xi Jinping took over. Their economy had gone up, just already, just enormously. And he basically said, hey, look, we can afford more than that. And besides, we really don't like what the Americans are doing. And so we're going to increase our nuclear capabilities. And so what they've done now over the last 10 years, they've taken this, what they always called it, sort of a minimal deterrent. They just would have enough. With a few hundred, we're still not going to take any chances that if they can get some of those to the United States of America, it will cause, essentially the harm that we never want to see here. And so they went from a few hundred to by now they're probably at 500 or so nuclear weapons, and they're moving up. And we've limited, by the way, the treaties that we've done with Russia, the last of which we have is going to run out next year. We've limited the ones that we have deployed to 1,550 nuclear weapons. And it's not inconceivable that the Chinese could get to those numbers, another 10 years or so. So am I terribly concerned about the Chinese nuclear? The answer actually is no. If I were in their shoes, I'd say, of course. We've got the bucks these days. They've brought the economy along. They have the technical capabilities that are needed. And if they really think they have a problem with the Americans, they sort of would like to get a similar force. But the reason I'm not all that worried about it, they just like the Soviets, they're not nuts. They're just not going to take the chance to have the mutual annihilation. But if I ever, finish the rest of my thing, my last slide is actually on China, and that is, we better work with the Chinese, but it's on economic-related matters, not so much the military.
Thank you. Our
Thank you.
next question's on this side.
Dr. Hecker, I've been reading about small tactical nuclear weapons. Do you think Russia might use one of those in or Ukraine? And what would the U.S. do?
Yeah, so actually, in some way, there's no such thing as a small nuclear weapon. That's what they're called, of course, and what we're talking about mostly here, we're talking about Hiroshima, Nagasaki. For the most part, that's what people think of as sort of a short-range theater nuclear weapon, 5, 10, 20 kilotons. Well, it ruined Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So they're serious nuclear weapons. When I told you the 1550 that we're bound by treaties, those are what we call strategic weapons that have the capability to be lobbed across at long distances. In addition to that, the Russians have at least 1,000 or so, and maybe more of these smaller theater nuclear weapons. And indeed, during the time after the first year of the invasion of the Ukraine, the U.S. was very concerned about the fact that Putin was being pushed back on his heels much, much more than he ever expected. And if they would have pushed him much farther, the Biden administration, and I work with those people, I worked with the Trump administration before, I work with the current Trump administration, and the Biden administration actually, they sort of put a number on it. They actually thought it was a 50-50 chance that Putin might use nuclear weapons. He was pushed farther. That's one of the reasons they didn't push as hard as one might have expected them to push. Could they have used them? Possibly. I still think this sort of global nuclear order, it's almost like a nuclear taboo. It's still the leaders with some sense. And by the way, and that is Putin. We don't like what he does. But the guy's not crazy. Kim Jong-un, North Korea, that guy is not crazy. Xi Jinping for sure. And so those people know what they're playing with. And so I didn't think it was going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen now. But we better make sure.
Send it back to Seamus, and then we'll have another question over here.
Thanks for coming. It was a very interesting talk. Takes me back in my history. But the question I've got is, you had a picture up there of the 10 nuclear
States.
people who are nuclear. And you mentioned the one about Iran and the color. The other one I noticed was Israel and the color. And Israel's had a nuclear weapon for a long time. It's lied about not having it. It's lied. Reminds me of Trump. But anyway, what I don't understand is you do ABC, atomic, biological, chemical. Atomic's probably not the biggest fear of the Israelis. But what my point is what's your feeling with what's going on in the Mideast now, and with Israel also having an atomic weapon, but it's not discussed?
Okay, so that's Bombs 102 lecture. I actually had, when I had that slide up, I had Israel in a peculiar color. And there was a reason for that. So I've never worked for the government, but I've reported to the government, obviously when I was at Los Alamos. And I still work with my Los Alamos colleagues. I don't get paid, but I'm still sort of motivated to make sure we do the right things. And because of that, and my connection to the government, my position on Israel has to be what the government's position is, which is we don't know whether Israel has nuclear weapons or not. And that goes back to a deal between Golda Meir and Richard Nixon in the 1960s, and the American government. And not even Trump. I actually thought at some point Trump may actually just go ahead and say it, but he hasn't said it. So we just say we don't know. You can read lots of books, and everybody assumes, that Israel has nuclear weapons, but they sort of do, don't ask, don't tell. That's the situation that they have. And now, as it actually turns out, quite frankly, what I could say, it doesn't matter whether they actually have nuclear weapons or not. Because what deters people is the thought that they have them. And let me tell you, the Iranians think the Israelis have nuclear weapons. And so whether they have them or not, it is already a deterrent. And so, yeah, the Israel situation, the Iran situation, really complicates the Middle East now. And in terms of the overall, and of course, and actually, let me just say, the situation of Israel and Iran and the nuclear weapons, and the fact that they went in and bombed those places, I must say, I can actually see some reason why they did that. Because quite frankly, the Iranians were lying, just for so long in so many ways. And we weren't really getting any place with the Iranians. I could see why the Israelis may want to go in and take out some. Having said that, I think there's absolutely no justification whatsoever in any way for what Israel is doing in Gaza. That is totally inhumane in every which way, but in the nuclear arena, that's a different world. I hope you don't cut me off altogether, because I got to finish the rest of my talk. Okay.
Question here, what do you think about the prospects of a Golden Dome and the value of that?
Yeah, so the Golden Dome, that is, actually, it started a long time ago, but it was really big during the Reagan days. And Reagan actually, I was at Los Alamos, and then my colleagues worked on missile defense, SDI related thing. Actually, I had one guy who wrote most of Reagan's speech during that time, the SDI speech. And it turns out Reagan actually, he had this moral sort of concept of saying, look, this mutually assured destruction, that's just immoral. We're threatening each other with destroying. Why don't we just protect ourselves? So Reagan was actually motivated by moral principles. And back in those days, in those early SDIs, and we at Los Alamos, we loved to work on a lot of the fancy things. Edward Teller and guys at Livermore, they did the X-ray laser thing, which was totally nuts. We couldn't do that then, we can't do that now. And SDI defending ourselves against Russian missiles and 41,000 nuclear weapons. There's just no way in the world it could work at that time. Now, it's come a long way, and it has lots of interesting possibilities, but the dome as such, that Trump took that from the Israelis' Iron Dome idea. There is no way you can protect the whole United States against countries that have a lot of nuclear weapons. If North Korea only has a couple that could reach the United States, we could do a lot of good. Against the Soviets and the Russians now and the Chinese, we just can't get there. Let me take a quick...
Yes, let's go back.
Okay. So there are two big things in my head that I worry about every day that is endangering sort of this nuclear world that we lived in. Okay. So the big one the first one was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Because when he invaded Ukraine, and just to show you, that didn't just come out of the clear. Take a close look at the expressions of these two presidents. They didn't have much use for each other. And so Putin goes all the way back to 2007. That's when George W. Bush was in, then with Obama. And Putin said he didn't like what America was doing. And then he decided in 2014 he's going to do something about it. This was during the Obama administration. And he went in and he annexed Crimea. This is actually my photo that I took when I was there in 2014, a few weeks after they invaded Crimea. It says Crimea and Russia together forever. So that was and he went into eastern Ukraine. That was his first step. His second one was February 24th, 2002, when he invaded Ukraine. And he's still destroying it at that level now, 3 years later. It is just unconscionable. But that's what he was doing. And then we worried, the question that was asked, what about nuclear weapons? Would he use them? Well, the answer is we don't know. We still don't know for sure, although I doubt it. But what he's already done, he's broken my global nuclear order. He's broken it because he's threatening the use of nuclear weapons to get what he wants. And then proliferation, the Russians, along with us and the Brits in 1994, they signed an agreement with Ukraine for Ukraine to give up some couple of thousand of nuclear weapons that it inherited from Soviet Union and ship them back to Russia. And the agreement, it was called the Budapest Memorandum, was that we'll leave you guys alone. You're sovereign nations. We'll never come in there. Well, guess what the heck he did? He invaded, and he's still bombing the hell out of them. And so why should any other country believe in getting a security guarantee? And so that's really bad. So this security alliance, as I told you before, is really important. Okay, the second one that I worry about is what we're doing to ourselves. Okay, so my view of how we got the global nuclear order, how we got to where we are, the United States of America, is based on things that go back to the Manhattan Project, and they go back to the time right after the Manhattan Project. And that is, we laid out a blueprint how to make America great. We actually laid out a blueprint and we followed a blueprint how to do that. And one of the key aspects of that was the Manhattan Project. He did something totally different than whatever had been done in the United States of America. It brought the scientists from the universities, from other countries in the world, all together to work on a project that was crucial to the United States of America, the Manhattan Project. And there's actually a book that was written by a number of historians while I was director at Los Alamos called a critical assembly. We usually call a critical assembly when you get enough uranium or plutonium together to go critical and then blow up. This was the critical assembly of talent. That was what Los Alamos was all about in the Manhattan Project. It wasn't just the uranium and the plutonium, it was talent. Okay, and then government funding for that. And so we were not the powerhouse of American science in the first half of the 20th century. We were in the backwaters. It was the Europeans. It was actually also Japan, many other countries who were ahead of us in science. Just to get an idea, Nobel Prizes in physics, the first 45 years up the Manhattan Project, we only got 6 out of 45. In the next 45 years, we got 62. And look at chemistry, 3 versus 41. I mean, we became a powerhouse because of what was put together. So it was, to some extent, the Manhattan Project. Second, it was this, another Bush. He was not related. His name was Vannevar Bush. And he came on, he was actually an MIT professor at one time. He came on and he ran the Office of Scientific Research and Development for Franklin Roosevelt. And he wrote this book called Science, the Endless Frontier. That is a blueprint for making America great. You know, it put together, it says universities are crucial. Research, federal funding of basic science is absolutely essential. That's what's going to make us great. He did make us great. He set up the National Science Foundation. Okay, and then of course, we had a resourceful democracy. We promoted an international order by forming United Nations, lots of other things, and system of allies. We helped our former enemies, Japan and Germany. However, now, in the last couple of decades, that international order, in fact, most of sort of the way we look at the countries and how we deal with each other and what the dangers are, we're now, in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, I showed you 17 minutes from, we're now 89 seconds from midnight. The arms control treaties, everything has started to lapse. It's coming apart. And this, by the way, I don't do political talks, I'll give you my opinions. This was before Trump too. Okay, we were at 89 seconds before. But now, unfortunately, with Trump too, and this is not the stuff you hear in the news every day. And this is the stuff you need to pay attention to. This is where our future is. There were people at the Heritage Foundation that laid out this mandate for leadership. And let me tell you, it's a mandate to the bottom. It's a mandate to the bottom. And it's just, we're denigrating our allies. We're bullying countries with tariffs. We're withdrawing from global programs and institutions. The dramatic reductions in federal funding, the basic research that made us so great, we just cut the NSF budget by 40%. I mean, who in the world? I mean, that's just like taking a revolver and shooting ourselves in the head. This is just, and again, this isn't against Trump, it's against what's happening in that administration. And again, it's not about LGDP, it's not about all the other social mores or whatever you do, because you might be on one side or another of that. But you ought to be on the side of making America great. And there's actually something called the Project 2025 tracker. They're tracking in 8 months, they say, oh, we're all done with what we've done. When they're all done, we're going to be at the bottom. And just the personal friendships don't do it. So here's Vladimir and Donald J. Trump. That's not going to solve the problem. Where he's got to go is you got to work with China. So back to the China question. China needs to be Trump's and our focus. We got to find a way of working together. We got to recognize, hey, look, this is a big country which become of age. They now have more scientific publications than we do by far. And just so you don't lose sight of China and the fact we can't just make them go away. We can't bully them. We got to figure out, how do we work with them? We're going to somehow have to share the world, because what we've had, rather than saying that we've been in the dumps, we've lost anything, it's worse than anything I've ever seen. Well, we have 4.2% of the world's population today. We have 26% of the GDP, the economic. We have 1/4, a little more than 1/4 of GDP. That's us. That ain't that bad, for 4% of the people. That's not so bad. China has 17% of the population and 17% of the GDP. We're going to have to figure out how to share that with them, how to work with them, and it ain't going to be about nukes. It's going to be about the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to keep you so long tonight, but you can see I get worked out about these things. Thank you.
Thank you so